In this video, I'm going to be talking about components in Figma. Now, there's been a lot of changes that Figma has added in the last year or so, and whether you're a beginner or a little bit more experienced, I'm hoping that this video will be a nice overview, and hopefully you can pull out some tips to integrate into your own workflow. So we'll talk about what even are components, how to build them, we'll talk about Figma properties, and then we'll talk about some advanced techniques you can add like interactions and just some best practices there. And I will touch briefly on some quick tips of how you can integrate these into your library. So when you're publishing out your design system, I'll throw out a couple of tips there, but this will be more heavily focused on components rather than design systems, since I'll probably do a couple of those videos down the road. So let's just go ahead and jump right in and talk about what components even are. I have this simple assembly page here to kind of break it down. I think buttons are a very obvious use case for components. If you're doing any kind of UI, UX design, whether it's for mobile or web, you're going to have buttons. And rather than recreating that every time from scratch, we can save that repetition by creating components so that we can just drag that building block in and we have a good starting point. So instead of reconstructing an icon and a label, we might actually put these together as a component. And creating components inside of Figma is super simple. So all I've done to show you this is I have an icon and that text layer, and I've dragged them down here. They're ungrouped, there's nothing happening here. We have a frame going on, but nothing is connecting these two. So the first thing we can do is actually select those two, and we can just right click, and then we can say create component. Now, this is not by default going to add auto layout, and if you don't even know what auto layout is, that's just going to basically automatically adjust the spacing and padding around all of these elements. But we can quickly add that by going over to the sidebar and hitting add next to that, and now we have auto layout, so we can control that spacing like this. We can also add padding, which we'll probably want to do since this is a button. Now, we don't have any kind of background layer or anything like that, and you may notice that there's no rectangle or anything like that. And that's because with auto layout, we can actually just add a fill layer. And let me change this to this purple color for now. I'll change the icon just so we can see what's going on here. And now that we've got that ready to go, we can actually add some padding. So I'll just add 16 pixels on each side. And I'll just recenter this. And pretty much there's our button. Now you can get a little more fancy with it. Like I was saying, you could add different colors here. Now this is not like a flattened icon, so I might click into the text here and just change this. You could add some rounded corners by going up to the border radius and setting that to whatever you want. But essentially, we've got this collection of icon, a background layer that's being generated automatically based on whatever content we have in here. So if we duplicated the text layers, that background rectangle is going to resize. So it's kind of like that invisible layer. And we've set this as a reusable asset in our design. So we can just alt drag, and this will actually create what is called an instance of a component. It's not a super obvious difference in the layers, but you'll notice if we look at the side here, we have 4 diamonds for the main or parent component. And then for the instance or child, we actually just have an outlined single diamond. If we're on the instance, you can always go back to that main component by going over to the right sidebar and saying go to main component. And if you do make that quick switch, you'll see at the bottom we can even jump back. This is really helpful if you're building a design system or a collection of components while you're working on a real world scenario. So for example, if I was working on all my components up here in this page, for example, and then I actually had my website here, and I'm making tweaks and then realizing I need to update the main component, you can switch back really easily that way. And that's just a cool little feature that Figma's added. And really that is the basics of what a component really is. It's to save yourself time and provide a level of consistency wherever there's repetition in your design. So like I said, buttons is an obvious example for any kind of design work these days, but this could expand to accordions or modals or whatever other kind of design assets that you need in your design. I've actually pulled in Material 3's design system. This is just a free community file that Material Design has on their page, and they have a ton of examples here. This is badges, they've got app navigation bars, there's buttons, cards for different content layouts, checkboxes, and the list really does go on. So there's so many different things you can build here, and that kind of gets into the realm of design system and building a whole design system, which is quite complex and quite a big undertaking. But if you're just a small team, even a solo designer, and you just need to speed up your design work, this is a great place to start. And my number one tip, right as we jump into this, is create components as often as you think you'll need them, as early on as possible. Because if you're just starting out, before, let's say you're working on a web design, before you have 20 pages with no components, just go ahead and create a couple components to start with as you're seeing any kind of repetition. Maybe if it's even just a simple heading and a paragraph, that's your component. Do that early on because it'll save you down the road once you have 25 instances of that where you've duplicated it and they're not linked. Then you have to go and update 20 instances. Just create them early on. It'll save you a lot of time down the road. So that is essentially a component. Now, up until recently, we didn't really have a lot of flexibility with components inside of Figma. You kind of had to do these manual hacks to create a bunch of different types. But one big thing you can do here is actually create variations. And if you go over to what's now called properties, you'll see we have a bunch of different types, and I'm going to jump into each one of these. But the most obvious case here is actually creating a variant. Now, before I create that here, I'll actually show you a finished example of what this looks like. And you'll see on the columns, we have different types of styles. So we have kind of the primary, the secondary, tertiary, and then in the I guess that's rows, and then for the columns left to right, we have the different states. If you're confused like I clearly was, you can actually run a cool plugin called PropStar, and I'll just create this, and you'll see it actually creates an embeddable table. Let's move this here. And it automatically adds all those layers for us that I have already built. This is actually a material design button. I kind of tweaked it a little bit to add some properties, but you'll see it kind of separates it into two groups. We have icons on and off. But you can see what I was saying there. We have a filled, an outline, and then an enabled or a hovered state, and it kind of expands from there. If you're really overwhelmed by the way this looks, don't worry, I'm going to break it down, but I just want to kind of show you an end state of how powerful these components can get. So going back to our example here, we just have just a default button. We don't have any different styles or anything. What we can do is go over to the properties and select add variation. This is probably the first place I would start because you very likely won't have just one single variation. You might, and that's totally fine. But to me, in this example with a button, it makes sense to start with a couple different variations. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to build different states here. So we're only focusing on this one primary button. So we're going to change this label to states. Then we're going to select inside of this new purple box. You'll see that there's this dotted box around to show that this is a collection or set of variations. Obviously, we only have one here, but we're going to go into this and make sure that it's set to default, if that makes sense to you. You might just have, standard or whatever your, non-interacted state is. And then what we can do is we can actually just add a variation, and we'll add this to be hover, and we'll change the fill to be a little bit lighter. So I'm just going to add a hover state with a black layer of about 20, or maybe we'll do like 35%. So it gets a little darker when you hover over it. Now it's totally up to you how you arrange these things. I personally, if it's just one set of components, I like to actually add auto layout to the whole group on the component here. And I kind of like to do states left to right, like you saw in that other example, and then styles top to bottom. Just to switch this really quick, like I said, I've added auto layout to the main component group, and that automatically snaps it. But because we're going to have multiple styles, I'm going to go ahead and remove it. So it's just a quick hack to kind of move stuff around if you have a bunch of different layers and you don't want to manually sit there dragging stuff around. So you can resize this box like you see here, but you'll notice that stuff does have these constraints to the top left. So if ever you're trying to resize it and you don't want all that to happen, you can hold the command key, and you can see now I can kind of crop or resize manually as you would expect it. That's usually how I resize these boxes. But there's another state actually at the top where you can automatically resize to fit. So if you've expanded a bunch of your components and it's still a small box, you can just hit that button and it'll automatically hug all the contents. So now what we're going to do is we have a default in the hover state, but we still have only one style. We're going to add a new variation property at the top right here. So just click add variant, and we're going to call this style. Now, you'll see that it says value already in here. This is for all the variations you've already created. Because we were only focusing on primary, we can actually go ahead and type primary in this box before we hit create property. And now you'll see that these styles have already been mapped to primary. So that's a quick hack. Obviously, if you've already created 8 versions, that's not going to really save you time. But if you're kind of doing it in this incremental approach, that's one quick tip there. So now I'm going to select both of these variations and I'm just going to Alt drag down. And then we're going to see that style has been highlighted automatically because it says that these properties and values already exist in the previous versions, which is to be expected. So we can just change this to secondary. And without actually jumping in and changing all these manually, what we could do is control the selection colors if we want. For now, I'm going to add a stroke because we will want a border. It's kind of the style I typically gravitate toward. We'll just add a primary color there. And now when we go into the fill, so I'm going to select the first one and I'm going to remove the fill. The border is already there. Now we still got to update our text. So I'm going to change this to that primary purple color. And then I'll remove the fill for the second one. And typically for, outlined buttons like this, you're going to want to have still kind of a fill once you hover to indicate that, but it doesn't have to be quite as extreme. So that's kind of up to preference. I'm really just making stuff up here, so totally up to whatever your brand standards are and what your preferences are. But I'm going to just center this. And now essentially we have 2 styles and 2 states for our button component. This might be breaking like a ton of different UX best practices. This is a pretty big button. Again, this is just to break down components. But one thing you'll notice is that these are not actually linked yet. There's no kind of prototyped interaction. We'll talk about that in a little bit because I want to go through the rest of the component properties. So basically, I've only shown you so far a couple variations or types of variant properties with components. You can use them to indicate different styles like we saw here for a primary, secondary, tertiary, so on. But you can also use them, and you kind of have to use them when you're adding any kind of prototype or interaction across different states. Now you don't necessarily have to link these up, which we'll do down the road, but typically if you have any interaction, you'll have to separate those out by interactions or by variations, sorry, because otherwise there's no way to link between different states within a button, if that makes sense. You'll see as we build these other properties why that's so important. So let's go ahead and jump to the next one, and that is Boolean properties. So you'll notice we have this icon in here, and let's say we might have a version of our button that doesn't have an icon, just text and the surrounding padding. What we can do is instead of creating a new variation and calling that no icon or icon primary, no icon primary, what we can do is actually add a Boolean property, which essentially just means true or false, to that icon layer. Now you'll notice when I click into one of the icons, we get this box down here that has kind of like the crosshairs. And this is a really great feature in Figma where if you're working within a component and you select a layer that has the same name in the other variations or versions, you can actually select all of them in one go. This means that we don't have to go through each individual version and link up to the Boolean property. And the way we connect that Boolean property is going to the layer, and we're going to click this icon here, and it'll say create component property, and we're going to say show icon. Now we can leave it the value set to true if we want the icon to always be on by default, or we can set that to false. So I'll go ahead and change that if we don't want it to show. I'll hit create there. And now you'll see our icon has disappeared, and all that really does is it hides those layers. Now let's actually drag an instance of our button out here to see how much we've done. So we can see the states there, we can toggle that, we can also toggle the primary, secondary, and then you'll actually see a new toggle to show or hide that icon. And again, we didn't have to create new versions. This is just Figma automatically figuring out what we want to do, and we can toggle that on just like that. Because effectively all it's doing is if you jump into that layer section, is it's basically just hitting the visibility icon on that layer, and it's just showing it to you at the top of that parent group. So you don't have to bury into the layers, and it's super helpful. So again, we can have it shown by default. If we want, we can just change it. Now I've selected the main component here, and I've gone into the settings of the show icon, and we can just change that to true. So let's go ahead and look at the rest of the properties. Now we have instant swap properties. This is where it gets a little bit more advanced, where if you're actually nesting components within components. Now you can never have a main or parent component within another main or parent component. They'll always have to be separate. And what I mean by that is we can't necessarily click into this icon and create a new component within here. You can see that this is actually already linked to other components within this document. So I already have a selection of icons here. Again, this is from material design, but you'll see all those icons here. These are all different components, individual components here. They're not a main component with variations. They're actually separate. And that's actually really key with how you link icons specifically. So if I jump back here, you can actually see in our dropdown that this is actually a component instance within a component. What I mean by that is we could actually click into this and put any component we want. So just to highlight it, I could put a card component. Now, obviously that looks terrible and that doesn't do much. And it's mostly because it's an entire element. It's not a 18 by 18, but you can see this is super messed up. So obviously we'd want to use this for icons only. So if I just undo those changes, what we can do is go find inside of this instance all the icon set. And for now, I'm just going to select the clock. Now we've got the clock selected, and what we can do is ensure that obviously we're not going to use a clock for every button we ever use, but we can ensure that the user can swap that out really quickly, and that's just using an instant swap. So where we set that component right here, we're going to select that create instant swap property. We're going to rename this to set icon. Before I hit create, you'll see that it actually has a section called preferred values. This is a really great feature if you're kind of the one building these components for a team, or even if it's just for yourself, where you can actually select the preferred elements. You saw how I added a card component and the whole thing broke and it looked terrible. And so obviously you're only going to really want to add icon components to the icon instance. And so here you can actually select all your icons, just like it popped up here, because it knows that you probably don't want to give access to everyone or every component you've created. And now we can actually hit create. So I'll come back and I'm going to fix this icon in a minute because I know it still has like a black fill. But if we create an instance again, you'll see we have a new property called set icon. And if I drop that down, you'll see just like we saw when we were creating that in the window, that we can now swap this icon out with anything we've created. And just going back to that list, we had like 60 icons already created. And now I can set that and style it however I want without adjusting that main component. And that's a quick thing I want to highlight. As you've probably seen, is I'm making changes to the instance without it affecting the main component. And you can do that to a large degree without actually detaching the component at all. Figma allows you to have what they call local overrides, which is kind of like custom settings you're adding on just to the instance without having it in the main component. So for the fill, if we decided we wanted this to be red or orange or whatever, you can see I'm changing that, but it's not affecting the main one. This might be useful if you're just kind of experimenting. For something as basic or critical as a button, you probably won't be doing this. But if you're even changing the font, for example, you can change that in here. And again, it's not going to upset the main component. Now, again, if you are in that experimenting exploration phase, you might say, hey, I actually really like the way this default looks with this orange. You can jump into the component instance settings here on the right, and you can actually select push changes to main component. I don't really recommend this. I don't think I've ever used this in the real world. I can see that it would be helpful for a couple of unique instances where maybe you really are honing in that default primary button, for example, and you want to push that to the main component. But to me, I just would rather adjust all my styles in one place because clearly I still have to update that orange for the other three instances. So I would always want to have a complete view of that main component and all those variations side by side. I wouldn't ever want to just focus on one state like that, kind of in this siloed view. But that's kind of how local overrides work, and it can be really useful. So looking at this icon, obviously we don't really want this fill, so I'm going to select all the icons again, And what I'm going to do is actually remove that fill there. And then for these instances here, I'm going to select those two for the secondary. I'm just going to make sure it's changed to that main purple color. Now you'll also notice that we have the clock icon on the top left, but we don't have it for the other three. What we can actually do is, because that's an instance, we're going to select the main component, that dotted line, and we're going to set that icon for the whole group here. So now when I select that, you actually go to the value. So you got to click in twice. You can change that. And I'll change it over and then change it back. We'll see why that's not working. It looks like the icon actually didn't connect on the others. So a quick way to fix that is you can select these three and you can delete it. And what we're going to do is actually select the whole component and hit enter. That's going to drop us down to the next layer. And we can actually hit Command V, and that's going to paste it into all four variations. And then I'm using the command and the brackets to switch the side because we already have auto layout set up. So somewhere along the way while I was talking, I messed something up there, but hopefully that gives you a couple extra tips on how to navigate those. So essentially, we've created 3 out of the 4 properties. The last one we can do is override any text layers. So again, I'm going to select all the text layers here, and now under the content, you'll see that same button to create a property. We're going to create this, and we're going to say label. And just like that, looking at our instance, we now have states, styles. We can show or hide that icon, we can set that icon, and we can also control the label just by typing in this box. Now another cool thing, just I'll wrap up with properties, is if you ever have a Boolean property that's also controlling an instance swap, you'll see when I toggle that off, it automatically hides the instance swap panel, which is this panel right here, because it knows you don't need to set something that isn't being shown on the design. And just like that, we've pretty much created our components. So that is the basics of component properties. That is most of what you'll probably need to know. The last few things I'll touch on is just some best practices and also how to prototype these different states. Again, you could go build this out with your tertiary and your text-only buttons and expand this out for whatever your needs are, but hopefully this is enough to get you going. What we're going to do is now just prototype these buttons so that you can actually hover over them and they'll automatically change. So if we hit Shift E, we can quickly jump from the Design tab over to the Prototype tab. We're going to click into our first default primary button, and we're going to drag this blue arrow over to the right column. Now automatically it's going to say on click and change to. We are going to leave the change to section, but instead of on click, we're going to select while hovering because this is obviously a hover state. And Figma is smart enough to know that you're changing within the components, and now you have access to those variant properties we created, which is hover and style. You might actually want it to map to the secondary for some reason. Maybe you've messed up the order or whatever, but you know you want to go from default primary to hover secondary, for example. You can see it actually remap that arrow for us, and then you can also control that animation. I'm just going to have it set to dissolve for now, and then we're going to drag the arrow for the bottom as well, and just set that to while hovering. And if you don't already know, you can't test anything out in prototype mode unless it's on a frame. So I'm going to drag this component group out, and I'm going to move it to the frame here with an instance. Then we can switch into prototype mode just like that by hitting play on that frame. And now you'll see that we actually have a hover animation, and it's actually changing out that state. Figma is also smart enough to know that if you change the label and all that kind of stuff, or maybe even change the content for different variations, that with that hover prototype interaction, it'll automatically switch to that. What I mean by that is if you, for example, have a drop down with a bunch of different options, typically with a drop down, it's not always open. What you can do is set the open state, change all the content you need for the 3 or 4 options in the list, change it back to the default, and Figma will actually remember the content. So when you hover or click, whatever the action is, it remembers that content. Obviously, now that I've updated this, you can see what I mean. By hovering over it, there's no issue there. That's essentially how to set up buttons with their hover states. You may be wondering why the pointer is not connected where the cursor actually changes. This will be automatically added once you have a click function or a navigate to for the button. Hover actions are not by default going to use the pointer icon. But what I mean by that is just, for example, if we wanted to redirect to another frame just like this, because I have that action now, you'll see that my cursor in prototype mode is now that pointer whenever I hover over it. And lastly, I'm just going to talk about some quick best practices for creating your components. You'll see that I kind of flew through those labels here on the right, but we have states, we have style, we have show icon, we have set icon, and label. I'm just going to recommend these as a default because, for one thing, Figma does not automatically resize this column, so you can't really put a lot of text. Off the top of my head, I think it's somewhere around 15 to 20 characters, so you have to be really strategic with what you call those labels. But whatever you do decide, especially if you're building out multiple components, buttons and drop downs, and you're using these kind of things where you're hiding and showing icons, for example, I would just be consistent with the label. So for the naming of the label here for show icon, you don't want to have set icon or hide icon on a different one. And typically you want to tie the name with the positive action or the active action. So show icon here corresponds with the state of when that's on. So hide icon could work as well, but to me, when I see a toggle that's active, that's kind of adding something or showing something, for example. But then for the others, just the states and the style, you want to be clear what that is. For the label, that's something that I found works really well. You don't want to just say text because it might not always apply. You might have different text layers that you're adjusting, and so you don't want to just have label, but you might have heading or paragraph. And in that case, it makes sense to change it, but as a default, I kind of use label, and that has pretty much worked for me for the most part. And the last thing I'll just say as far as publishing these components is you want to be really careful with how you share this out in your library. If you are publishing, just one thing to note is, first of all, we haven't relabeled this component, so I'm going to hit Command R and just say button. And you can actually add all of these components within different folders. You may remember when I jumped into the components here and we looked at local, we have components, we have styles, and test page. That actually all corresponds with what the pages are on. So anytime you create a new page and you create a component within that page, it automatically groups it in a folder for that page. Then as you go into it, anytime you add go into a page, anytime you add a component onto a frame or even a section, it's going to add a new folder as well. So if I jump back over to the material design here, you'll see, for example, we have dividers, we have dialogues. All of these are frames. They're actually got auto layout with the components inside. And if we jump back over here into components, you can see what that's saying. We have dialogues, and you'll actually notice that there's the actual components there. So that's just something to note. Anytime you add section, anytime you add a slash inside a name. So for example here, if I were to say, components / button, we jump back over here, go over to local. Under test page, you'll now see that components is in there and then button, whereas before button would have shown up at the root folder right there on the test page. So that's just a quick tip as you're publishing these out. Don't make it hard for your designers if you're working in a team to find those components. Just make it easy on yourself, but also make it very clear what they're clicking into. It's not fun clicking into a bunch of different folders. It's not the easiest experience right now in Figma. But other than that, that's been it for components. That was a basic overview and a couple of best practices and tips. Hopefully you found that helpful. And if so, be sure to like and subscribe so I can make more of this content. And drop a comment for other ways you're using components or hacks and tips you found. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.